the South African and Namibian constitutions. Sorry, I'm told you can't see me. At this juncture, I wish to make the following housekeeping announcements. May we please keep our microphones on mute. We are recorded, and all times can we remove all the distractions and keep our microphones on mute. We have interpretations. If you click the interpretation icon, we have 3 SADC PF languages: English, French, and Portuguese. The meeting is recorded at all times, so please keep that in mind. If you need to speak, may you raise your hand when it's time for discussions. If you wish to communicate, there is a chat box where we can all write our messages. The video, please make sure that your video is clear. Please make sure that you are seen at all times, for we sometimes take pictures for the meeting to proceed properly and for our live streaming purposes. We may wish to write our names on the names icon properly for housekeeping so that we have our records. And at this juncture, I would like to invite the Secretary General of the SADC PF to take over. Thank you. SG?
Thank you, Masenati, for ably introducing us and locating us so that we are present for this particular meeting. Good morning, Honorable Speaker from Botswana, who has graced us this morning in this meeting. Good morning, honorable members. Good morning, staff of national parliaments and SADC Parliamentary Forum. Honorable members, allow me to welcome back Honorable Speaker Dithapelo Korapezi, who is no stranger to the SADC Parliamentary Forum, the youngest speaker in the history of SADC, second having been Mauritius, who also had the youngest speaker at the age of 44. Honorable Speaker Dithapelo is no stranger to the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Professionally, he is a political scientist. He is also qualified in public administration. He holds a PhD on governance and is currently studying for an LLB. Honorable Dithapelo Korapezi has held various portfolios at the SADC Parliamentary Forum, the latest being that of the Committee on Trade and Infrastructure, this particular committee that we are convening over. He is now holding the position of speakership in the National Assembly of Botswana, and we find it fitting that he welcomes us to this meeting and you know, for us to have an opportunity to congratulate him from assuming this very important position in our governance structures. At this point, Honorable Speaker, you may kindly take the floor. I think we started off too early. The Honorable Speaker is probably going to join us promptly. At this point, Trudy and Professor Erasmus, welcome. And we want to thank you for always being, you know, available for us as the SADC Parliamentary Forum. And just to underline the fact that we don't take lightly your presence, your resources, and the time that you expend in making sure that we actually are able to hear more about what is happening in the region on matters of trade, regional integration, among others. It goes a long way in facilitating members of parliament in this regard. So we started quite early, and I'm sure that the Honorable Speaker will join us. Maybe let's give him 2 minutes. I didn't realize that we rushed too far ahead. I thought he was already online.
Thank
Trudy,
you.
you may just say hi, just to spend that 1-2 minutes so that we start promptly at 10 hours, because I know that you are quite scheduled during this period.
Thank you so much, Secretary General Bhuma. It's always a great pleasure to work with the SADC Parliamentary Forum and, of course, your office. The Honourable Speaker, in his absence, we look forward to welcome him in a couple of minutes. And honourable members, it's a great pleasure for Professor Erasmus, and he can open his video to join you once more. And we were just working together yesterday on the presentation. And honourable members, as you are well aware, trade is a very dynamic space right now. So if we had prepared all the slides a week ago, much would have been out of date already in this really dynamic, complex trade environment. So good morning to Professor Erasmus. Professor Erasmus, can you hear us?
I had some trouble in activating my microphone, but may I add my own good morning statement and confirming and repeating all the nice things that Trudy has said. And we are looking forward to an interactive, productive session this morning and this afternoon and tomorrow. You have promised that you'll work hard with us. So as soon as all the protocols have been attended to, and as we say in our part of the world, all protocol respected, then we can fire away.
Thanks, Professor Erasmus, and honourable members, absolutely. We have shared with you the presentation and some background material. And as we work through the sessions today and tomorrow, we will also share further material and updates. And as you proceed with your work program this year, of course, trade matters will come onto the agenda and various manifestations, discussions about our own integration agenda in SADC. Of course, the tripartite free trade area is still with the SADC chair. Then there's the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we mustn't forget SACU within the context of our important integration agenda. And then, of course, the global trade developments. A question which we are debating quite extensively is, of course, what happens to the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act? So, honourable members, you will see that in addition to discussing the regional integration agenda, which the Secretary-General has asked us to focus on, and in particular on the African Continental Free Trade Area, we have included some slides which focus on the global trade policy and governance developments. And we look very much forward to engaging with you on these and, of course, the regional integration issues today and tomorrow. The presentation you've received is divided into the 3 sessions. Of course, since we're meeting again this afternoon and tomorrow morning, if one session runs a little bit into the other, then we certainly can accommodate that. So we're quite flexible to make this address the agendas that you are working on, the questions and contributions that you have. So Secretary General, we look very much forward to these 3 sessions. We'll just wait for your guidance when the Honourable Speaker joins and makes an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Yes, the Honourable Speaker is making his way. This is how important this session is. He's leaving the house and coming to join us. So for that reason, we find that we are going to be, but yes, indeed, Trudy, those are very important, issues that you have outlined. And thank you so much for making those additional slides, particularly
Yeah,
because...
Madam SG, I don't know if you
Oh,
can
thank
hear
you.
me.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, welcome. And We really appreciate you taking time to really join us. I've already introduced you and indicated the wealth of experience that you have, both in academia and having working in interparliamentary organizations. And with that having said, Honorable Speaker, may you kindly take the floor and give us a bit of your wisdom in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam SG. I don't know how I was introduced, but my name is Ditapelo Kiorapets. I'm Speaker of the National Assembly of the Republic of Botswana. I've only been in office since November last year, so still very new and finding our feet. But fortunately for me, I've been in Parliament. This is my third term. And I've also served the SADC PF. I think it's close to a decade now. Yes. So let me extend my sincere gratitude for this wonderful opportunity, for the invitation to attend this important event. We, from our side here in the Parliament of Botswana, as I say, we still have challenges in the sense that 70% of our members are still new. So every day there seems to be an activity geared towards, helping members of Parliament to really settle. So that is why we may not have many of them attending, and that even in their caucuses, I think they're still having those trainings. But this is very important. I have served the SADC PF in my capacity. I became a de facto chair of the Committee on Trade, Industry, Finance and Investment, because I think at the time Lesotho was supposed to chair, and I think they were experiencing challenges. So I became a de facto chair for 2 years. And those were very, eye-opening, interesting years in serving in that committee. I think just as a way of, appreciating today's event is to start off by saying, globalization presents a challenge and the consequent need to approach issues as a formidable, regional blocks, which is why we have this notion of regionalism. And as the SADC, we have the SADC Secretariat, which is headquartered here in Gaborone. Then we have the SADC Parliamentary Forum, which will transform into a regional parliament. And I believe that there will be a resuscitation of the SADC Tribunal to adjudicate on regional matters. So, and basically the idea is to, take advantage as a region of our 9.85 million square kilometer of land and about 360 million population, which is around 4.9% of the world population, to take advantage of this market with a combined GDP of approximately 720 billion. So there has been concerns that there is less intra-regional trade, there is less intercontinental trade. And I believe that that is why most of our countries in Africa are signatory to the regional and continental trade treaties and agreements. I think it's very important that as the African continent, we move towards taking advantage of the 1.5 billion population in Africa, the 2.8 trillion GDP, and the 30.3 million square kilometers of land, which is endowed with lots of resources. So I think it's important to really engage in terms of what really we need to do as the region, as SADC, as Africa to improve, the trade. How do we improve mobility of people from country to country? We still have countries in the region, in Africa, which are still closed to even fellow Africans. It's difficult to to move around. So we need to be moving towards a free flow of goods, free flow of finance, liberalization of finance, but also most importantly the ease of movement, because it's really, really challenging. Just recently, there was an issue in Botswana in terms of people raising concerns about the long queues of trucks, and these trucks are they carry goods from, say, South Africa or from Namibia through Botswana to other countries such as Zambia and the DRC, all the way to Tanzania, and that there was long queue, so unreasonable that it's an impediment to trade. So these are the things that we hope to be talking about and making sure that we deal with them. The visa issues, the immigration issues, I think those are the key issues. I'm sure we are seeing the developments in the United States with the new administration in place. But again, in Africa, to what extent are we also, reading ourselves in light of what is happening internationally? Do we have that free flow of people from country to country? What are we having? But also to discuss other pertinent issues which have far-reaching implications on the growth of African economies. I will keep on referring to the developments in the United States, where overnight it's uncertain in terms of the aid that has been coming into Africa. What does it say to the African, leaders in terms of making sure that we are building strong economies, we process our minerals or our natural resources into finished products, we create jobs, we trade with one another, and we grow our economies, we develop our economies so that we reduce the dependency on aid. So I think just in summary is to say that these are important initiatives where lawmakers will also have to understand their mammoth role of the provision of effective oversight on the executives as they make decisions regarding trade. Will these decisions benefit the population? Will these decisions lead into a creation of jobs, bridging the gap between the huge income and wealth inequalities that exist? Will they be mitigated with all these decisions that are made on behalf of the people? So it is for MPs to provide effective oversight on their governments, their leaders, to make sure that laws that promote ease of doing business are enacted, laws that will improve on intra-Africa, intra-regional trade are put in place for the good of the people. It's very important that such trainings are done for MPs and staff of parliament, as they also capacitate their members of parliament. So I don't want to spend all the time talking, but I think just to say that let me thank you most profusely for this opportunity, and I wish that we will have fruitful deliberations today and the other day when we will be attending this training. I have committed to attending this morning and in the afternoon and the following days. I've asked my deputy to hold the fort for me. I'll go into the house to preside later in the afternoon because I think this is a very important activity that I cannot miss. Thank you very much, Madam SG and the organizers. Let me thank you for organizing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker. We really appreciate, and in your absence, I did introduce you as one of the youngest speaker in SADC. Indeed, at 42 years old, Mauritius tried at 44 years old, but for now you hold the fort. So indeed, your wisdom and issues that you raise should also be reflective of the times that we are in, the geopolitical environment, the regional integration, and in particular, ensuring that we don't lose sight of our role as members of parliament. So at this point, Honorable Speaker, thank you and welcome yet again to the SADC family and the SADC Parliamentary Forum. We look forward to supporting you as the Speaker of the National Assembly of Botswana. Thank you very much. At this point, allow me to hand over to Trude and Professor Erasmus to proceed with the training. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, SG, and a very warm welcome from our side, Honourable Speaker, and congratulations on your appointment. At that age, of course, it means you have a long career ahead of you. And so we look forward to engaging with you in the future as well. Professor Erasmus will join me, and I see him online, but I do want to touch on a couple of points that you've mentioned. And intra-Africa trade, honourable members, remains low by comparison with other regions of the world. And there are very good reasons for this, and we will discuss some of those. The reality is that much of the intra-Africa trade actually takes place in Southern Africa, and indeed in SACU and SADC. So we'll have a look at some data and certainly say something about the role, the potential of the African Continental Free Trade Area to boost intra-Africa trade, also noting the limitations of relying only on a free trade area to boost intra-Africa trade, because of course we need to develop our capacity to produce competitively goods and services that we can trade, because then we can change both what we trade amongst ourselves, but also how and in what we trade with the rest of the world. Honourable Speaker, your reminder about the global governance developments, I think, is extremely important. We are not insulated from those developments. They will impact the World Trade Organization, multilateral trade governance, but also, of course, as you referred to what's happening in Washington, our relationship with an important trade, investment, and development aid partner. And as we watch for new developments, of course, we have to reckon with a new trade, economic development aid reality. I think you've mentioned some of the practical realities related to improvements of governance, and whether it relates to the ease of doing business, the trade facilitation agenda, dealing with the long queues at the border post, more transparency in terms of rules and regulations that govern trade, cross-border movement of persons, extremely important aspect of regional integration. And this reminds us, of course, that our integration agenda is a very comprehensive one. It's not only about trade, but it is also about many other areas of cooperation, the shared water courses, cooperation in promoting educational outcomes, tourism. It's also about peace and security. And so there's so many areas that we can focus on. But let's start with our first session. And this really takes a look at a bigger picture overview. And this takes us back to some of the foundational discussion issues. Why nations trade? Why is trade so important? How are trade negotiations conducted? Why do we negotiate trade agreements? How do they enter into force? And the role of the national parliaments in that process, but also in the oversight of the negotiating process, is extremely important. How are trade agreements implemented? What happens when the rules are violated?
Are we not muted? Because we can't hear Trudy.
I think she's frozen. Maybe
Okay.
she'll come back on. She'll come back on. Thank you, Prof.
Could I ask Nina from our Tralak office whether she is available and can help us with the scrolling down of the slides while we wait for Trudy to come back to join us? Nina, are you there? Okay, thank you so much. Could I ask permission then to proceed and deal with the substance of our presentation of this morning? Would that be okay?
Indeed, Prof. Indeed, Prof. Kindly proceed.
Okay. I do not have an explanation as to what happened to Trudy, but she's a very dedicated woman. She will definitely come back and join us. Nina, can you scroll down to the next slide? Okay, that gives an indication, the other two slides, for what is happening later this morning and this afternoon. So here is the first slide for the presentation for this morning. And it's an introductory matter, asking the questions, why and how do nations trade? And when we discuss these issues, we have developed a particular focus for the sessions of today and tomorrow. Now, let's stick to that together for a moment. Let me say I'm honored by the fact that I've got all these learned people in the audience and this young dynamic speaker, who is the youngest speaker of this parliamentary forum ever. I think I'm the oldest professor here. So between the two of us, we will have some balance. I also want to emphasize that we have designed this presentation in order to achieve something which is bespoke, which is designed for the needs of the audience. And you must guide us in our discussion. And therefore, feel free to interrupt us at any moment. There will be opportunities for answering questions later on. But part of the focus will be, in addition to providing factual information and an interpretation of what is going on in our region and in the world, we will also have to focus on what is the role of a regional parliamentary forum and of national parliaments when it comes to negotiating and concluding international trade agreements, and then very importantly, implementing them. Now, let me say in advance that trade agreements are legal instruments that are negotiated among states, the governments representing those states. And as a matter of fact, it's the states and not the governments that are the parties. That's one implication. We'll come back to that. A second point to make is that private parties, individuals, traders, importers, exporters, firms, do not automatically have any standing under international trade agreements. Governments go there, and only governments can access, as a rule, the dispute settlement arrangements that we have made for ourselves when integrating and liberalizing trade in Africa. There's one or two exceptions, and we'll come back to it. But having noted that, there are two implications. If trade agreements are not self-executed, we cannot take a trade agreement after it's entered into force and run to the local courts and say, implement it. That's not possible. That's constitutionally not possible. So trade agreements need to be implemented through domestic measures. And many, many of those domestic measures are about legal instruments, about amendments to existing rules and regulations, updating national tariff books, or adopting new regulations or laws in order to give effect to international trade agreements. Now, this will be different from country to country, depending on what your national constitution provides on the relationship between international law on the one hand, international agreements, and on the other hand, the law of the land. So let's flag this implication. In addition to providing an opportunity today and tomorrow for discussing in some detail developments in international and regional and global trade, and asking what are the implications of what is happening in the world. In addition to that, let's focus also on what is the role of parliaments. And there are at least 3 areas that we should monitor in this regard. The first one is the policy decision to engage in new negotiations and to have new trade agreements and regional arrangements. The second one is the entry into force, the ratification of international agreements. And the third one is the subsequent implementation. And it's in the domestic implementation that we will encounter these other issues, some of which have been mentioned, like trade facilitation. What happens at borders? How efficient are we in processing trade governance and customs administration? And also, not only must we focus on trade in goods, but also, and that's increasingly more important, trade in services, and as we have heard this morning in the introduction, also the movement of persons. So this is the broad picture and the considerations that have inspired the design of our presentation. Why and how do nations trade? Well, trade theory tells us that there are all sorts of benefits involved in concentrating on those goods and the production of those goods in which a country has a comparative advantage, and then it can export those and import other products from other countries where they have a more competitive advantage. And the implication over time and as trade increases is more efficiency, lower prices, and consumers that will benefit. That's the theory. Now, if we have questions about trade theory, Trudy can answer them in more detail later. But the other reason is our common sense tells us that we can't prosper in isolation. We need to import and export in order to develop and to grow and to become more successful. And if that is true, then we start from the point that we recognize that, let's take the African continent. The African continent is divided into sovereign states, and all these states have borders. And even if we form international regional integration arrangements like SADC and SACU and the AFCFTA and the TFTA, we still have to do so on the basis that the relevant countries and their governments must come together and they must negotiate the legal instrument, the rules for opening up the borders, for adjusting the tariff books, for making sure that the sanitary and phytosanitary and health and technical standards are complied with. And very importantly, by recognizing that once a country is a party to an international trade agreement, it has to follow up with domestic governance. It must amend the tariff book. It must make sure that it can comply with the rules of origin and the technical standards and so on. So that governance aspect is important. We are starting to see a logic here. We can't prosper in isolation, but we do have states, and states are sovereign entities. We will come back to the meaning of that concept. So if these states recognize the need to integrate and to trade with each other, how do they do it? And there is actually only one mechanism, and that is through a rules-based arrangement, which will be anchored in the relevant agreements. And these trade agreements are normally very comprehensive, and they have many annexes and protocols, and then they must be implemented. And if there are disputes about not recognizing and respecting the obligations that governments have freely accepted, then there must be an avenue for sorting the problem out. And that is at this core that we in Africa haven't got a good record. Our governments never litigate against each other over trade issues. We just claim that they sort it out in other manners, but the evidence there is not that convincing, at least not to the point that we can say we don't need a dispute settlement mechanism. By the way, one of the first protocols, together with the protocol on trade and goods and protocol on services, was the protocol on dispute settlement adopted in the context of the AFCFTA. The AFCFTA has a detailed, very sophisticated dispute settlement protocol. So the rules are there. Apparently, our governments, when they negotiated this arrangement, this ambitious arrangement for the whole continent, were of the opinion that dispute settlement is an inevitable element of that arrangement. Trade agreements are not single dimensional. They take into account all the other legitimate interests of the participating countries, such as how to protect national health, environment, how to share resources. Trudy mentioned that in our part of the world, sharing of water courses is an important example. And then we say in the penultimate bullet point that trade is not an end in itself. Trade agreements must be implemented with a bigger philosophy and objective in mind, and that objective is, and we also heard that in the introductory remarks, so that ultimately our people are better off, that we have development, that we have employment opportunities, that we have growth in the domestic economies, that we have industrialization, that we can advance and produce more and trade more and export more and import what we need. So let me conclude by saying that technically, okay, may I proceed? The last point there says it is not actually the governments that are trading. The governments are responsible for concluding these trade agreements, but, and we will always have to remind ourselves, with a few exceptions like public procurement, it is not the government which will produce particular goods and then find a client in another economy and enter into a commercial contract and then import and export. The private sector are the investors, the importers, the exporters, the service suppliers, and so on. So this very important fundamental objective must always be kept in mind. Why do we have these trade agreements? What will change as a result of liberalizing trade? Now, could we go to the next slide? Unless there are contributions. Nation-state sovereignty and negotiations. Now, all states all over the world, the biggest ones, the smallest ones, are sovereign. They have sovereignty. Now, a state is defined as an entity, a legal entity, which has territory, population, and a government. And the government of which you are actually part is vital for looking after national interests and promoting them in relation to other nations. So what happens at borders? If we have a properly designed regional arrangement to make sure that there is good governance at borders, then we can implement our trade agreements effectively. If we haven't got governance at borders, and if we haven't got trade agreements, then of course it's the law of the jungle. It's smuggling. It is a undermining of the national interest. So there are obvious benefits from rules-based approaches to domestic governance, to international cooperation, and to trade. But sovereignty also has its limits. Sovereignty is actually, as this bullet point tells us, a legal concept. It says that the state has territory, and therefore the state has jurisdiction over its own territory. It means what comes in and what goes out. And the people that go there and visit there must respect the law of the land of that particular country. I cannot rock up at a border post in any Southern African country and say, I want to spend the next week here as a tourist. I have to produce my passport. I have to go through the control functions exercised by the Department of Home Affairs, normally the immigration officers, I'll have to declare what I import and export. I have to comply with the law of the country I'm entering into. And the opposite also applies. So sovereignty is vital for understanding international trade agreements, but we must also understand that once we have concluded an agreement, once we have negotiated, accepted, and ratified agreement, we cannot subsequently invoke our sovereignty and say, okay, 2 weeks later, I don't like the implication of foreign goods coming in and posing a competition for my domestic industries, so therefore I'm not going to implement this agreement. Once we have, as a sovereign nation, exercised our right to sovereignty by concluding a binding international agreement, we must respect it. We cannot subsequently invoke sovereignty or even our national law or constitution to say, now we are not respecting the agreement anymore. That shows us how important preparation is and how important it is to very carefully consider what we agree to. And what we want other nations to agree to and what they must respect. Because if we conclude these trade agreements and we don't respect them, then why have them? Now, in the national interest is always a starting point for the policies, the prior policies that we adopt in how we will conduct our trade relations and our foreign policy relations. The limits to sovereignty result in practical adaptations that we must mark. As I sometimes say, mosquitoes don't carry passports. They don't recognize sovereignty or borders. Climate change, regional matters, environmental affairs, regional peace and security. So we must understand that sovereignty is not a negative wall that we can build around our countries. It is an element in a structured, well-designed, rules-based form of interaction with our neighbors. And if we pursue the road of regional integration, then of course, these agreements and the instruments and the institutions that we establish become necessary and vital and useful for dealing with all the additional problems, such as climate change, such as diseases, such as scarce resources, stability and peace, and so on. So there are therefore many reasons why we conclude these agreements. And then once we have done so, the big challenge starts with implementing them in a certain and predictable manner so that private party stakeholders, importers, exporters, and investors have certainty about the rules that apply. They will know exactly what the tariff is that applies to the import or the export of a local or a foreign product, what the procedures are, where to register, what will happen at the border post. Because if there's uncertainty, trade will suffer, investment will suffer, and then we will lose the benefits. So we have to look at how these agreements are subsequently implemented. I'm also asking a question, what happens if a new government takes over after some years after an international agreement has been concluded? Let's say there was an election and the new government is now in the majority. What happens to the predating international agreements? Because they apply to the states as the parties and not the governments, they continue to apply. If we would have a complete suspension of all international agreements every time there is a democratic election, there will be chaos. So that is rather straightforward. Now, you can, of course, tell me and ask me, but if you look at that last bullet point, but is this not exactly what President Trump is now threatening to do? Not to honor international trade agreements binding on Washington? The answer is yes. We don't know exactly what he has in mind, what will replace the dispensation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. But this is one of the challenges. This is a very complicated time in multilateral cooperation. What President Trump is, by implication, actually suggesting to happen is to undermine and follow a different approach to the multilateral trade order that has been in existence since 1947, since after the Second World War. Now, how long is that? That's almost 80 years. 80 years of rules-based multilateral governance appears to be threatened now by what the new president in the White House intends to do. And we therefore have to monitor very clearly what is happening there. And the lesson for me personally to be drawn to that, from that development is that's not the way to go. Utter unpredictability, uncertainty, and chaos will result if we would see that as a recipe for how we conduct our own private relationships and our official relationships in this part of the African continent. If it is true that states are the parties to international trade agreements, but that governments don't trade, how do we deal with the needs of private parties? And that is a challenge for parliaments. What happens to the needs of the importers, the exporters, the investors? What happens if their rights are violated by a foreign government, which is also party to agreement, or by their own government, not complying with the obligations of concerning liberalizing trade in goods, for example, or if they don't change the tariffs as they have accepted to do. And by the way, we have recently, over the last few years, and even till last year, seen court cases in other RECs, like in COMESA, where exactly these issues have come up for decision. We can go to the next slide. This is just an article, Article 23 of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which I very quickly want to share with you, because this contains an answer to a question that we have already posed. If we negotiate as governments representing states, we negotiate and we negotiate till we have a final text of an agreement. What happens then? Now, the typical answer and the logical answer is, once the negotiations have been completed, have been exhausted, and the parties, on the basis of consensus, that is how we do it in Africa, the state parties, now agree on the text of the deliberations. Then that text must be transformed into an international agreement. The end result of the negotiations do not, or does not yet translate into an international agreement. Something else must be done. First of all, the text must enter into force. So what we have here is the article in the African Continental Free Trade Area that tells us how typically international texts have to be ratified and enter into force. And once they have entered into force, they must also, depending on your national constitution, be made part of the law of the land in accordance with your constitution in order to be finally implemented. So if we read very quickly through this Article 23, it says the ACFTA agreement, this is what the term refers to, and its protocols on trade and goods, trade and services, and dispute settlement shall enter into force 30 days after the deposit of the 22nd instrument of ratification. Let's pause there for a moment. The negotiations for the AFCFTA started, the decision to have an AFCFTA was adopted in 2012 by the African Union, the Assembly. The negotiations for the legal instruments of the AFCFTA started in 2015. And then they negotiated and negotiated. And in March 2018, there was an extraordinary summit of the AU in Kigali. And at that occasion, the text of the founding agreement and of these three first protocols mentioned here in paragraph 1 were submitted and adopted, and the member state of the African Union then decided, despite the fact that the negotiations were not yet concluded for the full AFCFTA, they decided to start the process of signature and ratification. Now, the AFC-FTA agreement is actually, and we will see that later on, we have our third session deals exclusively with the AFC-FTA. But there we will see, we've got a slide there with the architecture of the AFC-FTA, that this is a compact, a collection of legal instruments. At the top, we have the founding agreement, and then we have, beneath that, we have a protocol on trade in goods, trade in services, dispute settlement. Those are the phase one protocols. And we also have protocols on competition, intellectual property rights, on matters that are still being sorted out, on investment, on women and youth in trade, and on digital trade. So it's a comprehensive collection. But to make it even more comprehensive, each protocol, let's say we've got, take the protocol on trade in goods. The protocol on trade in goods contains the principles on non-discrimination and how the tariffs must be phased down, how to deal with non-tariff barriers, how to deal with trade facilitation. Underneath the protocol on trade in goods, we have 9 annexes. And those annexes are about the detailed obligations on liberalizing tariffs, on the rules of origin, on dispute settlement for particular issues that we call anti-dumping, countervailing, and so on, what the customs administration, and so on. And in each and every one of the annexes, we have appendices. So it is a for the lawyers, it's a feast. It's a detailed collection of legal instruments. Now, we have a challenge in the history of the AFC-FTA. When that decision was adopted in 2018 to start the signing and the ratification process, the negotiations were still incomplete. So what then happened is this paragraph 1 kicked into operation, and countries started to go through their national procedures, their constitutional requirements for adopting international agreements. And very soon, this requirement was met. And the 22nd instrument of ratification was deposited with the Commission of the AU in the beginning of May 2019. So by the 30th of May 2019, the AFC-FTA officially entered into force. But you have probably picked up that although the AFC-FTA agreement is in force, no preferential trade is taking place under the rules of the AFC-FTA. Now, how is that possible? And it is possible because very important building blocks are still outstanding. We still haven't got the tariff schedules, and we still haven't got the annex on rules of origin. That is as far as trade in goods is concerned. We also have many outstanding issues on trade and services. So because the AFC-FTA is a free trade area, and a free trade area cannot be implemented without tariff schedules and rules of origin, we haven't yet got any trade, preferential trade under the AFC-FTA rules. Of course, there's a lot of trade on the continent, but not under AFC-FTA rules. Here in Southern Africa, in SADC, for example, where the highest incidence of intra-African trade takes place, there is preferential trade. And that is what makes your position very important and very, very noteworthy. SADC, COMESA, EAC, ECOWAS, those regional economic communities have their own regional integration arrangements, and they have their own trade protocols. And those trade protocols, the SADC trade protocol, provides for exactly the same objective, namely trade liberalization, the removal of tariffs and NTBs, non-tariff barriers, in terms of procedures adopted in that protocol, and also to remove the non-tariff barriers. Can we go back? Thank you. I want to pause here for a minute. The AFCFTA does not abolish the regional economic communities. We will come back to that later. And I will cite you, I will show you, I will quote from the text of the AFCFTA agreement, where it is deliberately stated that the regional economic communities that have already formed free trade areas and trade liberalization arrangements, they continue to exist. And they are described as the building blocks for the AFCFTA. It's important to note that it means that SADC, for example, is a building block for the AFCFTA. It is engaged in the same type of business. And as a matter of fact, the entry into force of the protocol on trade and goods of the AFCFTA, once they have dealt with all the negotiations, will not dramatically change the flow of goods under preferential rules. It will, for all practical purpose, continue under the SADC trade protocol. But if everything across the continent can then be covered by preferential trade, then it means, let's say, if a country such as Botswana exports goods to Nigeria, once the AFCFTA is fully enforced, then it means that that trade will be liberalized. That the tariffs that apply will be phased down over the period provided for in that protocol. And then the trade, which presently between Botswana and Nigeria is conducted in terms of MFN rules of the WTO, the multilateral system, will then be conducted in terms of the preferential rules of the AFCFTA. So what the AFCFTA will actually contribute is to put an umbrella over the whole continent to allow for preferential trade in goods and services. But of course, it's not self-implementing. Governments will have to take the necessary steps. Whether the private sector will indeed now start to export, let's say, beef from Botswana to Nigeria, that's a commercial matter. That is not something that the trade agreement will guarantee. The producers and exporters of beef from Botswana will find their own markets. They will look for the most lucrative markets, and that is where they will trade or import and export to. I also want to note that the effect of having a continent-wide preferential system is not self-executing. These, in addition to the private parties doing what is commercially logical for them, they will need to produce the goods. We must have industrialization in order to exploit the potential of the AFCFTA. At present, the official data indicates that only about 15% of the goods that African countries export are destined for other African markets. Part of the explanation for this low figure is that there is, firstly, a lot of informal trade also on the continent, and that is not always captured in the data. So it may be that the actual trade volume is bigger. But the second inference to be drawn from that information is that we still trade primarily in commodities. China is, for many African countries, the biggest trading partner. But what do we export to China? We export commodities, minerals, mostly. So the domestic challenge to industrialize in order to prosper, in order to grow and to develop that remains. Just note here very quickly that the other protocols, in addition to those mentioned here, namely the phase 2 protocols on intellectual property rights, competition, and investment, plus new ones that we deem necessary, they also have to be signed, ratified, and instruments of ratification be deposited in order to enter into force. So this phase 2 protocols of the AFCFTA must still go through this procedure. And it might be that depending on your national constitution, you as parliamentarians will have a particular role to play in this ratification process. And then if countries later on accede to the AFCFTA agreement, then they will have to submit instruments of accession and so on. The depository of the AFCFTA is the chair of the African Union Commission. Next slide, please. Here I'm trying to answer another question. What is the role of national parliaments in respect of giving effect to international trade agreements? I cannot and didn't go through all the national constitutions of the member states of SADC, but the theoretical answer is you will have to consult your national constitution. It will contain provisions on the relationship between international treaties and international law on the one hand and the law of the land. Now, what I'm quoting here is something that I'm familiar with, which is the relevant section in the South African Constitution. And I'm quoting it here just because it lists and it makes it easier to discuss the principles that are involved. Now, the first paragraph says the negotiating and signing of international agreements is the responsibility of the national executive, not the parliament. So that policy decision to negotiate a new international agreement is taken by cabinet ultimately. And cabinet will issue the instructions on how to prepare and whom to send to those negotiations to represent the state in question. Once they have completed their negotiations for a new trade agreement, as I said before, then they adopt that result on the basis of consensus. There's also provision on that in the AFCFTA. And then it enters the phase of signature and ratification. And signature and ratification are also executive acts. But look at this important implication. An international agreement binds the Republic only, that's the Republic of South Africa, only after it has been approved by resolution in both the National Assembly and the Council of Provinces. That's the basic principle. So in the South African Constitution, and this is not necessarily so in other regional constitutions, there is a constitutional principle that says Parliament must have a peep, must have a look at the text of an international agreement before the government ratifies it. So what is the role of Parliament? It's the role of approval. So how does that happen? Well, the National Executive, the Ministry of Trade mostly, will have to keep Parliament or the Portfolio Committee for Trade in Parliament informed about progress, what happens all along the line, so that they are not caught unprepared when eventually one day on the agenda for a particular day's discussion, there appears an item. Today we are going to discuss, in order to approve the text of the new trade agreement. Keep them abreast, keep them informed. Now, this is normally not an issue because the majority government is the majority in the executive, in cabinet, and also in parliament. And therefore, that requirement in paragraph 2 will be met. I want to ignore paragraph 3. That is something rather peculiar in the case of South Africa. It deals with technical, administrative, and executive agreements. The AFCFTA doesn't fall in that category. But let us look at paragraph 4. That is important. An international agreement becomes law in the Republic of South Africa only when it is enacted into law by national legislation. And that is where parliaments may enter the picture. National legislation includes not only acts of parliament, but also regulations adopted in terms of existing law. So if the national tariff book has to be updated because we have concluded and become party to a new trade agreement such as the AFCFTA, then the Minister of Finance normally issues new regulations in order to insert a new tariff column into the national tariff book. So there's a rather straightforward logic here, but to conclude this discussion on this slide, your own constitution will contain the rules on a role, if any, for Parliament in approving the text of new agreements, and for the follow-up involvement in policy development and in the domestic legislation that is required for implementing treaties. In the South African Constitution, there is, for example, also a requirement that regulations must be tabled in Parliament from time to time. And then there is the very important principle that was mentioned by our speaker, and that is the oversight role of parliaments. And that will depend on the oversight role for a particular parliament as defined in its own constitution. So this oversight role of the trias politica, we have got the executive branch of government, we've got the legislative branch of government, and we've got the judiciary. Your own constitution will tell you what is the oversight in terms of a particular country. But now we come to a regional parliamentary forum. And therefore, the question arises, what is the function of a regional parliamentary forum when it comes to these considerations? There is a difference between a regional parliamentary forum and a regional parliament. A regional parliament is a more advanced, deeper integration arrangement, and it's quite challenging. We know that, for example, in the EU, there's a regional parliament. So I don't want to go into that issue, but I just want to put it on the agenda that parliaments, in whatever form or structure, have typically legislative and oversight functions. And you know better than I do what your oversight functions are in the position that you are in. So let us note that oversight, as our speaker said this morning, is a very important function of a successful and dynamic parliament and parliamentary forum. Could we go to the next slide? Here we talk very briefly about trade governance. What is trade governance? Trade governance is a very important form of governance. And the moment we talk about governance, we again talk about parliaments and your oversight functions. Governance is generally the exercise of state powers in a constitutional manner and in the public interest. Transparency is an extremely important dimension of governance. Trade governance makes transparency and openness and compliance even more urgent, because we're now dealing not only with domestic measures, but with measures that go beyond our borders. And we can demand that we, in country A, which is a party to an agreement, are entitled to compliance with good governments also in the other state parties to an agreement. So trade, international trade, I define here, is as commerce, commercial activities of a wide scope across borders of sovereign states by private firms and investors under the applicable rules and under the conditions in the 21st century. We will come back to those conditions later on. And in order to make this possible, the second bullet possible, we need the third bullet. We need treaties, we need certainty, we need trade agreements, we need institutions, we need predictability, and we need forums where the officials can come together from time to time to make sure that they are on the same page, that they do the same thing, that their subsequent regulations are harmonized and achieve the same objectives and outcomes. We must prevent fragmentation. So trade negotiations are about, for trade in goods at least, securing reciprocal market access with certainty and predictability. And during the negotiations, the representatives of a particular country, the officials going there on behalf of the government, will make sure that all the offensive and defensive interests of that particular country are accounted for, are promoted. What are offensive interests? Offensive interests are about the interest for access to foreign markets. Defensive interests would be, how do we protect domestic markets? But because each and every one of the 54 countries participating in the negotiations in the AFCFTA have offensive and defensive interests, the challenge is for the negotiations to find the compromises. And it is not easy, as we see in the case of the AFCFTA, to find those compromises. As a matter of fact, if we want to explain why does it take so long for the AFCFTA negotiation to be completed, then the answer is it's not because the participating governments are mala fide, but it is because they've got differences in opinion and different needs when it comes to their national offensive and defensive interests. It is very difficult to get 54 countries at very different levels of economic development in agreement around the same table about the same issues. Some countries on our continent are still, for example, dependent on tariff revenue for the fiscus. Now, trade liberalization means that you trade goods duty-free, so the tariff revenue will disappear. So are those countries then prepared to open up their markets? Those are some of the explanations. Trade agreements require coordinated policies and proper regulation subsequently. Trade agreements are not self-executing. It must be followed up by domestic action, domestic implementation, and that puts the emphasis on trade governance. Does each and every country take all the required measures in order to properly implement the trade obligations so that the private sector can benefit, importers and exporters, and so that there is certainty, predictability, transparency, and legal remedies? Don't underestimate the vastness of the governance challenges that come with modern international trade and integration agreements and arrangements, as we have them already in SADC. States are the parties to treaties, but private parties are the investors, the importers, the exporters. Now, regional integration takes the matter further. Regional integration says it is a good thing to start with recognizing that a particular group of countries in the region can benefit from trading with each other in a more deeply and more liberalized fashion as they do under the rules of the WTO. That's what we did in SADC many decades ago. So SADC is a typical example of a regional trade arrangement. It's a free trade area. Now, what is a free trade area? It is defined in the rules of the GATT of the WTO. A free trade area is a trade arrangement amongst countries in which the tariffs on substantially all the goods traded amongst them will be removed over time. We in SADC are already at that point. Now, the economists normally say that we must give a meaning to what is substantially all trade. And the rule of thumb is that 90% of the tariff lines must be liberalized. In other words, the duties removed, the duties phased down to zero in order to liberalize substantially all trade between the member states of a free trade area. And in a free trade area, we must also remove all those other restrictive regulations of commerce. That is the language of Article 24 of the GATT. And what are these other restrictive regulations of commerce? Nowadays, we call them NTBs. So the freedom of movement of goods across borders amongst the members of a free trade area involves primarily good governance at the borders, good customs administration, good cooperation, in order to remove all the obstacles to the flow of goods, payments, services, and eventually also people, although we do not yet stand there, and make the movement across borders of commercial products, commercial activities, free and unencumbered. And for that, we need clarity on the rules, we need good governance, we need predictability, and we need rules for dispute settlement when it doesn't happen. So regional integrations go further, and we in SADC are in a regional integration arrangement, and we as the member states of SADC also all want to become and be involved in the African Continental Free Trade Area. We can check it later on, but I think all the member states of SADC has already ratified the AFCFTA. The final point here says deep integration as a legal arrangement, as a rules-based arrangement, will impact on national policy space. And that's very important. We will see that there are provisions in the AFCFTA that deal with what we do in respect of pre-existing other trade agreements. Now, the AFCFTA is global trade friendly, but I want to make the point that there's an important difference between a free trade area and the next step of regional integration, which is a customs union. In a free trade area, the basic starting point is that the member state can still conclude trade agreement with third parties on their own, bilateral agreements. In a customs union, such as SACO, you can't do that. In a customs union, the arrangement is more deeply integrated. So the members of a customs union have agreed that they will have a common external tariff. So they can't on their own agree different bilateral trade agreements with third parties. They must do it collectively, jointly, so they protect the integrity of the common external tariff. And secondly, within a customs union, there's a single customs territory. If I travel from Stellenbosch, the Cape Town area, to Namibia, for example, as I do from time to time, then I don't pay import duties on the wine that I take across the border. There are no import duties leveled on goods traded amongst the members of a customs union. There may be other arrangements, but duties on traded goods are abolished. Next slide. Trade governance continued. Remember, I just want to emphasize again the role of legal instruments and institutions in order to make sure that regional trade arrangements are rules-based. Predictability, certainty, and remedies. Why do I emphasize this? It, not only because it is logical and bona fide, but it also reminds us there is a function for parliaments, for legislatures in this regard. And there must be a balance between national interests, legitimate national interests, and international commitments. How do we reach that balance? Well, we must start doing so from day one when we negotiate these texts. Parliaments can check whether it has happened. A little bit of history. What happened after World War II? Now, the history before World War II in the 1930s is part of the answer. There was a worldwide depression in 1933 and onwards as a result of banks that went bankrupt and international agreements that were abolished, and the decisions of countries to close their borders for international trade. And it became a vicious downward spiral, and we all knew how those conditions and the unemployment and so on favored dictators like Adolf Hitler, how he came to power in the 1930s in Germany, and in 1939, the Second World War broke out. More than 50 million people were killed in that war, and eventually peace came after much devastation in 1945. The Allied powers, namely United States, United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, they came together and they decided that the multilateral order had to be organized in a manner that will prevent domestic conditions from developing again, causing a repeat of the terrible lesson that we have to learn from what happened and why the Second World War broke out. And the multilateral order that they then established consisted of the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and they also wanted to create an international trade organization, but that did not happen. Only one chapter in that International Trade Organization draft charter, only one chapter got accepted, and we call it the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And it's very important. From 1947 till the end of 1994, multilateral trade in goods was conducted under the rules of the GATT. And those rules are basically those here that I will mention in a minute. But all of our countries, when we became independent, we joined the GATT. So the multilateral order finds its manifestation in these instruments that were agreed in the aftermath of the Second World War. The United Nations, for example, has the General Assembly and the Security Council. Security Council is sometimes controversial. So what were the basic principles that were agreed in 1947 to regulate international trade in goods, multilateral trade in goods? And the principles were basically the non-discrimination rules. We call them the MFN and national treatment rules. There's a rule that once nations have negotiated to reduce tariffs, then those tariffs are bound. And how do we know what is the level at which tariffs for a particular member state of the GATT have been bound? We find it in the tariff schedule for that country. Just as we find the same information in respect of the AFCFTA in the tariff schedules of the AFCFTA. There are requirements on transparency, on notifications. If you as a member state impose certain measures domestically that impact on your obligations, you must immediately notify them so that all the other members may know. What will they then do? Well, they will definitely, once they are notified, engage you, and if they are of the opinion that you have violated an obligation, then a dispute will be declared. By the way, the WTO, which was formed on the 1st of January 1995, went further and also had a additional chapter, additional set of obligations on trade in services and on dispute settlement. So the dispute settlement arrangement of the WTO is very interesting. It says it is a single undertaking and it is compulsory. If you have done as a member state something that another member state is convinced that is a violation of your obligation, it can activate the dispute settlement procedures of the DSU. The first stage is mutual consultation. Sometimes, in many instances, the consultations lead to a dispute settlement outcome. If that doesn't happen, then the DSU has two further possibilities. Either you refer the dispute to a panel for a ruling, and if the parties accept it, that's the end of story. If they don't accept it, then the panel ruling can be referred to the appellate body of the DSU. What was very successful in the DSU was the fact that countries couldn't say and couldn't respond by arguing, I'm sovereign, I'm not going to submit to the DSU. Once you're a member of the WTO, the DSU has jurisdiction over you. And there were hundreds of cases, more than 400 of these cases since 1995. Unfortunately, the appellate body of the WTO does not function at the moment because of the international multilateral political tensions. So just to mention that free trade areas and customs unions are actually in principle, violations of the MFN requirement of the GATT, because it says, the MFN says, once a member of the WTO, or before that, the GATT, has extended to any other member state, and there are more than 160 of them, you must immediately and in an unqualified fashion extend the same benefit to all the other members. Now, if you form a free trade area like SADC, and you say that the trade in SADC is the preferences, the benefits of the trade in SADC are limited to only the member states of SADC, then on the face of it, you are violating MFN. How do we get by that one? How is it to be explained that there are so many regional trade arrangements from the EU down to in Africa and Mercosur and elsewhere in the world? The reason is that Article 24 of the GATT makes it possible to have free trade areas and customs unions, provided you liberalize substantially all trade in goods and services in that FTA. You do so within a reasonable period of time, and you also remove all the other restrictive regulations of commerce. These are the multilateral requirements for the compatibility of something like SADC with our multilateral obligations. So what happens at borders? At borders, customs officials must implement all these rules that apply to the trade that is conducted from and to that particular country. Now, if we as members of SADC, member states, also belong to COMESA and also belong to the AFCFTA, then we have the problem that we're all familiar with of overlapping membership. So how do the customs officials deal with the implications of overlapping membership? Hopefully they are well-trained, well-resourced, and know exactly what is going on. They must be fully informed about the manner in which they have to implement all these trade agreements to which their country belongs. Next slide, please. Trade in the 21st century. Now, Trudy has added this particular slide to tell us that certain technological developments in the 21st century have impacted greatly and directly on international trade in goods. Now, one of them, the first one there, is that the production process itself has become what the economists call fragmented. If you take a motor car or a cell phone or the smallest production, take a pair of shoes, the production of most commercial goods does not begin and involve inputs and products for each and every requirement and phase of that production coming from the same destination. The leather will come from here. The buttons will come from there. In more advanced industrial goods, motor cars, computers, cell phones. I once saw an analysis of this where someone has taken a cell phone on which it was indicated made in China and demonstrated that for the inputs of the goods and the technology and the intellectual powers and the trademarks and what have you, there were inputs from more than 300 countries. That is the modern production process. Now, for agriculture, it's different. You will also import goods. It might be fertilizer, it might be technology, it might be capital equipment like harvesters and tractors and so on. But it's easier to identify the domestic identity, the rule of origin of a agricultural product. But competitively produced agricultural goods do need import. So this is the reality of the first century. The global and regional value chains based on efficiency and competitiveness. Now, what we are starting to see now, especially after the war in Ukraine, is that this logic, which has governed the global trade arena, at least from 1995, when the WTO was formed, till 2022, when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, that we now have a disruption. There are sanctions. There are tensions with China, for example. Countries are now increasingly, and firms, not countries or governments as such, firms are redesigning and reorganizing their production facilities. They're now saying, okay, no, I can't run the risk of some of the inputs for my production coming from countries which might soon be hostile to us. So they are concepts like nearshoring, friendshoring, and we see a rearrangement in the industrial production process. Another important development is about the tradability of services. Services, what are they? They're not goods. Services are not exported by putting them in a box and then the customs official will inspect it at the border. Services are banking services, insurance services, transport, logistics, rail, harbors, those things. And we immediately understand that they are vital inputs for effective trade in goods. We haven't got access to finance, we haven't got access to information, if we haven't got reliable transport, then we have consequences such as we heard this morning, the congestion at the border post, the long durations, and we have more scope for corruption, for bad governance, for delays. And the more delays and additional costs there are, the less competitive we are in terms of producing those goods. So the role of services. And then came other technological developments, artificial intelligence, digital trade. So we stand at the point in the history of development and of the world as such, that there are dramatic technological advantages connected to new developments, and that we must make sure that we keep abreast of those developments in order to have them domestically available. We are all also facing the uncertainties of what the Trump administration is now starting to do, and we'll come back to this, in terms of upending the post-World Trade Order, post-World War II global order. Could we go to the next slide? We're almost there for this morning. Here is a discussion on what tariffs are. Tariffs are a form of a tax. It must be paid at the border. Ultimately, it will be reflected in the price of the good. If there are high tariffs on a particular product which is imported, the importers will pay more for it. That is what's going to happen in the United States. If the president increases all these tariffs on goods imported in the United States, someone will have to pay for them. Here we refer to different types of tariffs. Customs officials know the difference between an ad valorem and a specific tariff. And then we end here this slide with the question, why do governments impose tariffs? Why does President Trump impose tariffs? Now, many governments look at tariffs because it's a form of revenue, of income for the fiscus. This is not why Mr. Trump is doing so. He says he wants to protect the domestic industries of the United States against unfair trade from foreigners, he says. They export subsidized goods. They discriminate against American goods, and so on. That's his way of looking at it. The economists are warning us that this will result in higher inflation in the United States. Next slide.
Perhaps just Professor Erasmus, if I may.
Oh, welcome back, Trudy. I'm so happy to see you. I've been battling on my own.
No, all good. You're doing a great job. Just honorable members, as far as the import tariff is concerned, when we negotiate a free trade agreement, it is to some extent very much about trade liberalization and reduction of duties. And certainly this has led to significant reduction of import duties over, I would say, the last decades. But what we're starting to see is that the import tariff is again becoming an increasingly important instrument, not only of trade policy to manage our imports, but also an instrument of industrial policy, so to protect the domestic industry. And I think here the conversation, particularly in the context of the US administration, focuses also on very important aspects of economic interest, of the national interest. So protecting domestic industry to reduce reliance on imports from partners who may not prove to be reliable under certain circumstances. President Trump has been on record saying that he's very concerned about the negative trade balance of the United States. And this is quite important because we do have a slide which focuses on what is the country's balance of payments. Now, the balance of payments, members would know, is a record of all international financial transactions that a country is engaged in. And it includes international trade. So when we export goods and services, we get foreign exchange. And this is one of the important aspects of why international trade is so important. Most of our countries are importing, for example, capital equipment, technology, which we do not produce locally. And those imports are very important to promote industrialization and diversification of economic activities, creating jobs. So international trade, very important source of the foreign exchange, which we need to finance the important imports that we need. But the balance of payments also records investment transactions. So if an investor, say from Turkey, comes to establish an enterprise in, let's say, Zimbabwe, invests in, builds a factory to produce, let's say, T-shirts, then that foreign direct investment, that transaction, that inflow of capital, of finance to build the enterprise in Zimbabwe is also recorded in the balance of payments. So the balance of payments is then divided into different sections. The first part is the balance of trade. And this is where we take a look at our imports and exports. How much are we importing and how much are we exporting? And President Trump has been saying that the United States has a negative balance of trade, saying they are importing more than they are exporting, and he wants to reset that balance. So the import tariff has become a very important aspect of what he says rebalancing trade. And so his aim is to impose tariffs, duties on goods coming into the United States. Now, what will the impact be? And I think, as Professor Erasmus has indicated, they're different impacts. Important to keep in mind that it is the importer that pays the tariff, not the exporter. But of course, if the tariff is paid by the importer, it means that the price in the importing country, let's say Zimbabwe, of that foreign produced product goes up. It means that the relative price of products which are substitutes for one another. So if we are importing T-shirts, but Zimbabwe also produces T-shirts locally, the price of the imported product goes up. It means, relatively speaking, the domestic produced T-shirts now become cheaper to the consumer in relative terms. And generally, because you and I as consumers, we all face a budget constraint, we're more likely to buy the locally produced product. That's what President Trump wants. But he also wants to make sure that he collects tariff revenue. So he's not stopping imports entirely, but he's increasing tariffs or duties on the imports. Now, how much tariff revenue will be collected is not easy to predict. Because if there are local products that are substitutes for the imports, then of course consumers will buy the cheaper product, and we may not get as much tariff revenue as we had expected. But if there are no good locally produced substitutes for the import, then we are likely to raise considerable tariff revenue. So these are very important calculations which are probably ongoing in the US administration at the moment. But, honorable members, these are also issues that are very much on our own integration agenda. As Professor Rasmus has indicated, under the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, we have not completed the tariff negotiations. And it's about the kind of issues that we're discussing here. For some countries, the tariff is an important source of government revenue. Some countries use the import tariff to protect their domestic industry, so they don't want to reduce the duties. In other words, they may well decide that the tariffs on certain products are not going to be lowered, so that those products will remain on the exclusion list. And we haven't completed those negotiations yet. So we're starting to see how important a very traditional trade policy instrument, the import tariff, has become globally. Because, of course, as President Trump has introduced tariffs on imports from certain countries, they have retaliated by doing the same, also imposing tariffs on imports of US-produced goods. And within our own integration context, we see how important the import tariff is as well. When we discuss SADC a little bit later today, we'll see that some countries encountered certain challenges in phasing down the tariffs that they had committed to in order to comply with their schedules of commitments for the SADC free trade area. And so it's taken much longer for us to reach the point of complete implementation of the SADC free trade area as far as tariff reductions are concerned. So I think we have reached the end of our allocated time this morning. Secretary General, if you could guide us on this, but it's a good point for us to stop because we will pick up on this in the afternoon and look at our regional trade agenda and the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Thank you very much, Trudy and Professor Erasmus. That was really quite enlightening and relevant at this time. And thank you so much for keeping to your time. You were able to really deliver within the 1 hour, 30 minutes. At this point, I don't know if any members would like to raise issues with you now or would bring them up in the afternoon, or what do you suggest? Trudy, do you have to run? Or we could take a few inputs or interventions from members and allow them to actually engage with you a little bit.
Absolutely, we'd be very happy to do that. Thanks, SG.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Honorable members, Honorable Speaker, thank you very much for being in attendance. We actually have a very good attendance, Trudy, about 89 participants, and this is really something that would like to applaud and thank honorable members for gracing this particular training, because it opens up opportunities for us to ask for more from TRALAC and continue this particular partnership in this regard. So, honorable members, Masenati, I believe you'll be looking at the names you'll be looking at the registration
box?
just for any, yeah, to see if there are any hands. I know Dr. Tokasani Kupe made a very profound comment earlier, which basically dovetailed into what you were saying in your submissions and the Honorable Speaker. I don't know if she's still there, if Honorable Kupe is still there, or any other member could kindly take the floor. Okay, Honorable Speaker, thank you. You may kindly take the floor.
Well, SG, just to say, to thank the esteemed professors and our resource persons for their eye-opening presentation. I just wanted to find out quickly whether whether there are studies quantifying the cost of barriers to trade, including tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Like what are the major ones, and can we quantify and value them and say this is the extent to which they are inhibiting trade or growth of the economies? I wanted to hear that, but just also to quickly react to on the on the domestic laws, especially the parent laws, which is the constitution, to say that in our jurisdiction, on international agreements, all international agreements and treaties, of course, our foreign ministry will have the registry, but I think there's a case law that says they are only as valid as being persuasive to the executive, and that they have no legal, they're not legally binding, but they are just persuasive. And I think it's something that, because as the new government, we are looking towards, the reform of our constitution. I think it's one aspect that needs to be looked into in terms of making sure that, Parliament plays a role in making sure that the agreements, international agreements, including trade agreements, are honored, and that there is an obligation on our part to honor them, so that it's not that the whims and caprices of whoever is in the executive, but there has to be sort of a structured. I thought I should just make those quick points, Madam SG. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker. I have a hand from Honorable Dr. Pinky Lesotho. Kindly take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, SG. Let me thank you all and congratulate our very new and young speaker, our friend. Congratulations. And I just want to, again, to thank him openly as he acted during the TIFI, which is the Trade, Industry, Finance and Investment Committee. He did a very good job, of course. Yeah, let me thank all of you, including honorable members. I don't really have much to say, but I want to thank again the presenters, Trudy and the Prof. This has been very, very enlightening. I've always found this topic very challenging, especially in the committees. And now gradually I'm grasping what is happening. And we are so thankful. And I think we still need more. We need more training. And that's all. Thank you so much for this enlightenment. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Treasurer. That is appreciated. I believe our presenters will take note of your request for continued capacity development. I don't see any other hands. Trudy and Professor Erasmus. But you have a lot of comments that are coming from the chat box where there's appreciation for this particular engagement. I'll hand over to you, Trudy, just to close off, and we'll meet again, honorable members, at 14 hours for the next session.
SG, thank you so much. I did also see a comment from the Honourable Member from Madagascar on artificial intelligence. And this is, of course, a topic that is developing so fast. We see competition among the big players in this space. How will it impact us? What's happening on the continent and our country? So quite important. But I'll ask Professor Erasmus just to respond to the Honourable Speaker's contribution, and then I'll say a couple of things about the other comments. Thank you, Professor Erasmus.
You are better placed to respond to that first question, whether there are studies that quantify the costs and the implications. And then I can say something which is not really necessary. Let me say something about the point that the Honourable Speaker has made about what is intended in Botswana about the relationship between domestic law and international agreements. This is a very interesting and noteworthy observation. Botswana has a constitution that is based on so-called the tradition of the dualist tradition, which says that the executive branch of government is responsible not only for negotiating, but also for ratifying it, and more importantly, that international agreements are not part of the law of the land unless they are incorporated. As I said before, what we do domestically under our own constitution is, of course, very important in order to ensure constitutional compatibility. But we cannot, vis-a-vis other nations that have different constitutions, invoke our national constitutional provisions and say, now we are ignoring our obligations under the treaty. So this is very significant what we have learned about the plan in Botswana. And we must draw a distinction about internal domestic validity and the international validity of international agreements. We cannot invoke our constitutions vis-a-vis other states, other state parties to say, no, I've got a constitution, I'm not going to honor it. We knew that before we started negotiating an agreement that will result in certain obligations. And even then, if we ratify that agreement, then it's clear that we have an international set of obligations and domestic obligations, and they must speak to each other. So this development that he's referred to, we have to take note of. That's very important.
Thanks very much, Professor Erasmus. To the question about the impact of non-tariff barriers vis-a-vis tariff barriers, there are indeed several studies by UNCTAD, the World Bank, IMF, and others, but also by the African Union Commission, UNECA, African Development Bank, and so on. And the conclusions are all very much on the same page. And the indication is that the impact of non-tariff barriers is very, very much more pernicious than the impact of tariff barriers. We've got to keep in mind, honourable members, that non-tariff barriers are often also not transparent. So we encounter non-tariff barriers at the border post, in some cases not expecting any impediments. And they cover such a broad range of issues. And if we take a look, for example, at small business SMMEs and their participation in cross-border trade, we often hear the same refrains over and over again. Complicated customs and border procedures, excessively daunting documentation and compliance requirements, challenges associated with getting compliance certificates such as standard certificates, sanitary and phytosanitary certificates, and so on. But there are many other instruments of trade policy, such as rules of origin, which can in fact become a non-tariff barrier if they are too restrictive. So we start to see that there are many sources of non-tariff barriers, and researchers have attempted to quantify the impact of those non-tariff barriers. And the conclusion, irrespective of where you look for a study, is that they are a much bigger barrier to cross-border trade than tariffs, because tariffs in many respects have been coming down over decades. So in the context of the World Trade Organization, but if we think about intra-SADC trade, under the SADC Free Trade Area, we have all been reducing our duties. And we were going to finish the process by 2012. Mozambique had 3 extra years to reduce its tariffs on South African imports. But some countries actually, as a result of domestic industrial development challenges, impact on jobs, for example, fell a little bit behind in the implementation. But what we've also seen in recent years is the introduction of new taxes, levies, surtaxes, and so on, to in fact almost substitute for the tariff reduction that has been implemented. So it's a very, very complex area that we're talking about here. But last year, Tralac did a survey across 21 African countries, and we were focusing on small, medium, micro enterprises, and we were particularly interested in women and youth-led enterprises. And we asked them, what are the barriers you encounter? And across the countries, the responses were in certain categories: customs and border management issues, so trade facilitation issues. And very often women complained about harassment, for example, at border posts. But there are also more generic non-tariff impediments to cross-border trade, such as, for example, access to finance. Now, access to finance is extremely important in our trade and services agenda because it deals with issues such as financial inclusion. And many of our small-scale traders are transacting in hard currency or in mobile money. They don't yet have bank accounts. So they're excluded from getting access to finance, trade finance, because they don't have a bank account and they don't have the necessary collateral in order to secure the loan or the financing arrangement. So it's an extremely interesting area to have a look at. And for this afternoon session, I'll bring some data just to share that with you. So thanks so much, SG, and we look very much forward to meeting this afternoon.
Now in terms of funding. Is that what you are saying? Because even the
I think, I'm not sure it was meant for us, but thank you so much. I like the last part where you integrating the issue of gender and women and small traders. It's quite significant because we've passed a few resolutions on same and also looking at these one-stop border posts and how facilitation can actually be improved in that regard. So thank you very much, honorable members. We'll kindly meet this afternoon using this. Is it a different link or the same link, Ronald?
The same link.
Using the same link. You'll also be given these recordings for you to be able to reflect beyond this particular hour. Thank you very much, and let's meet at 14 hours, honorable members. Sincerely humbled, and I appreciate your participation. Thank you.
Apologies, SG. There's a hand from Angola.
Oh, okay. Apologies, Angola. The honorable member's name, can you see, Ronald?
Honorable Lazaro.
Okay. Oh, Honorable Lazaro. Okay, Honorable Lazaro, kindly take the floor.
Okay. But
Thank you. Apologies for that. Desculpa.
posso. Muito bom dia a todos. Quero saudar efusivamente todos os participantes, com maior ênfase os dirigentes da SADC presentes,
para dizer que acompanhei com muita atenção as várias preleções que foram feitas relativamente ao comércio livre na região da SADC, as taxas, as tarifas, todo um conjunto de políticas que nos podem levar para uma economia africana sustentável. Devo encorajar para que todos continuemos nessa senda, porque este é o único caminho que pode levar a África à prosperidade. Se os outros continentes estão a ser bem-sucedidos, nada nos diz que a África não pode seguir o mesmo caminho. A África tem recursos humanos, a África tem recursos naturais à altura. E então podemos fazer, sim senhor, aquilo que os outros estão a fazer. É uma questão de todos nós nos compenetrarmos que somos capazes de transformar aquilo que tem sido o calcanhar de Aquiles para as nossas economias para uma economia próspera para cada país e para todo o continente africano. Cheguei um pouco atrasado por causa das chuvas que se abatem sobre Luanda, mas deu para ter uma ideia sólida sobre a importância dos temas que estão a ser abordados. Muito obrigado, estão todos de parabéns.
Muito obrigada. Thank you very much, Honorable Lazaro. We appreciate your input. Another slipping in the issue of climate action in there in relation to trade, Trudy, the rain in Angola, just got me thinking about disaster, preparedness and many others. However, thank you so much. May we kindly conclude this session and convene at 14 hours. Thank you very much for your intervention, Honorable. It was an intervention. I don't know if there were questions. Is there any input that you'd like to make, Trudy? It was an intervention validating, yes, some of the inputs that were made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Admin, we may kindly terminate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trudy.
Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you all this afternoon.
Of course.
Thank you.